The day was already stretching, pulling its warmth over the village nestled beside the Nile. In the stillness of early morning, the land felt eternal, untouched by time. The river, smooth as glass, reflected a sky that seemed endless, broken only by the occasional ripple from the few boats drifting lazily across its surface. It was a world held in suspension, as if nothing could disturb the peaceful rhythm of life. Among the huts, life began to stir. A woman's hand, still covered in flour, paused mid-knead, the dough soft in her palm, as if the moment had frozen for just a heartbeat. Nearby, a child barefoot has always played at the edge of the village, the scent of burning wood curling through the morning air. The sounds of the village were gentle, the rhythmic clinking of tools, the low murmur of voices. There was no urgency here, only the slow flow of another ordinary day. And then there was a runner. The man's sandals made a soft thud on the packed earth, a quiet but purposeful sound that seemed to carry a weight the rest of the village didn't yet understand. His stride was fast, yet there was no haste, no frantic rush. He moved like someone who already knew what was coming. As he passed through the village, heads turned. The man's purpose was clear in the way the others watched him, the way the air seemed to shift around him. In his hand was something simple but powerful, a scroll sealed with the mark of the state. The runner's arrival was not a surprise to anyone. It was a moment that felt both inevitable and strange, like the sun rising over the Nile, yet somehow different today. The village had known this day would come, though perhaps they hadn't expected it quite this way. His footsteps were the first tremors of something much larger. Even now, the seal remained unbroken, but the people around him already knew. The decision had been made. As the runner approached the central square, he called out for a young man unremarkable in appearance, his name lost in the shuffle of faces. There was no need for him to step forward. It was clear to everyone that he was the one. He rose slowly, unsure of what he was meant to do, but already bound by something unspoken. The runner handed him the letter. It felt heavier than it should have, and the young man's fingers trembled slightly as he held it. The seal was smooth, cold to the touch, as if it carried the weight of the world within it. And yet, what was inside it would only be a small part of the story. The real power lay not in the words written there, but in what would follow. Around him, the village continued as it always had. The woman resumed her kneading, the child ran in circles, the river slipped by without a pause. Yet all of this now felt distant, as if something had subtly shifted in the space between breaths. For the young man, the world would never return to the way it was. His hand closed around the scroll, but his mind was already elsewhere, drawn into the unknown weight of the future that awaited him. No one knew exactly what the letter contained, but they didn't need to. Everyone acted as though they already understood. The draft, they whispered, though no one was sure what it was for. A war, perhaps? Or something else? It didn't matter. What was important was the certainty that the time for peaceful days was over. This was not about chariots or gold, the things that the stories told. It was something far quieter and far more insidious. Power did not travel through the air on the backs of horses. It flowed through papyrus, through ink, through words written in the language of control. It moved with a precision that felt mechanical, unstoppable. It was a machine that measured, that taxed, that punished. A machine that remembered. And just as quickly as the runner had appeared, the young man was already walking away, the seal heavy in his hands. His path was set, and there was no turning back. In the distance, the river continued its endless march. Life went on. But for him, for now, nothing would ever be the same again. The mystery was no longer in the letter itself, it was in the choice that had been made. Why him? Why now? What did the state see in him, in his life? The questions pressed on him like a weight he couldn't escape. What was this draft really for? Why did it feel like he had been chosen? Or worse, like he had never really had a choice at all? As he moved further from the village, toward a future he could not yet see, The land around him seemed unchanged. The rhythm of life, the pulse of the Nile, remained steady and slow. But now, for him, the world felt different, as if it had always been waiting for this moment. It was the first step in something much larger, a quiet march that had begun, and there was no turning back. The path away from the village stretched out before him, and with each step, the world grew larger. The young man had left behind the small rhythm of daily life, the quiet hum of his home, and now he was entering a different world, a world where lives were measured, counted, and catalogued. The idea of duty was not a noble or romantic thing here. It was simply a force of nature. Like the floodwaters that came and went with the seasons, it was inevitable. It arrived with a certainty that felt like gravity itself. The land, the harvests, the people, all were subject to the same unyielding rhythm. At first, it seemed like something distant, a far-off expectation. Yet now, as the young man walked further, he could feel the weight of it pressing on him, felt the way it had shaped his life long before he knew it. The state, with its intricate system of labor and measurement, kept track of everything. They counted the households, the fields, the harvests, and now they counted him. His name, his body, his time. He had been part of the tally all along, though he had never felt the pull of it until now. In this world, there was no such thing as an individual, only numbers, quotas, and the constant drive to maintain balance. Above him, the invisible forces of the system hovered, each one essential to the machinery of the state. The local official, who oversaw the village, held a certain authority, but was bound by his own obligations. He was a cog in a larger wheel, much like the young man himself. Then there was the scribe, that unseen hand of power, the one who translated lives into ink. And above them all, looming over everything, was the temple, an institution that knew no boundaries, a force that worked through every corner of Egypt. Far in the distance, if you could imagine it, was Pharaoh, his image, a constant reminder of the order that governed everything. It was not a personal power, but a living embodiment of control. Pharaoh's will was the state's will. It was simple, impersonal, and absolute. The young man's mind, though still filled with thoughts of battle and glory, began to shift as he walked. He had imagined that he would be selected for something great, that his name would be called because of his strength, his courage, his worth. But the reality, he soon discovered, was far more practical. The draft was not about heroism. It was about numbers. It was about filling quotas matching one life to a need, a body to a duty. And this was the nature of Egypt's system. Not grand gestures or lofty ideals, but the quiet, persistent demand for service. As he arrived at his first destination, he was met not by soldiers or commanders, but by paperwork, by scribes whose ink-stained hands transformed the day into lines and columns. There was no fanfare, no selection based on valor, only the cold, efficient process of counting. It wasn't about him, it was about the state, about keeping the gears of Egypt turning smoothly. What he thought was a summons to battle turned out to be a summons to bureaucracy. And as he sat down to wait, the reality of the draft began to take shape. Soldier, he had thought, meant a man who fought on the battlefield, but the truth was far more mundane and far more expansive. A soldier could be anything: an armed guard for a temple, a rower on a boat, a laborer in the quarries, a frontier watchman standing at the edge of Egypt's borders. War was only one of many faces of service, and in this vast system, every face counted. He was not being chosen for bravery or valor. He was being chosen because someone, somewhere, needed a number to match a quota. It wasn't a heroic act, it was simply part of the great machine that made the world move. And as he sat there, the weight of that realization settled on him, as heavy and undeniable as the sun above. The question now was no longer why he had been chosen, but how the system would reshape him, just as it had reshaped everyone before him. This was not about war. This was about something far larger, far deeper. It was about a world where people were measured, counted, and turned into parts of a greater whole. The system, relentless and impersonal, would not care who he was, it would only care what he could do, and what was expected of him. As he looked around at the scribes busy with their work, he understood. This was where the story of his service would begin, not with a sword or a shield, but with ink and paper. The scribe sat behind his desk, the small room bathed in the soft light that filtered through the narrow window. The air was still, the kind of stillness that made everything feel quiet, too quiet. His hands moved with a calm precision, the reeds scratching against papyrus, each stroke of ink a weighty, deliberate gesture. To the recruit, this world seemed strange and unfamiliar. There was no shouting here, no urgency, only the steady rhythm of the scribe's work, and the slow realization that in this place, decisions were made not by force, but by the quiet power of documentation. The scribe's face was calm, almost serene. There was no malice in his eyes, no cruelty in his manner. He was not a villain. He was simply a man who knew the power of paper and ink, a man whose job was to keep order. His words were few, his tone polite, but each question he asked seemed to slice through the recruit's thoughts, drawing out details that felt insignificant at first but would soon become crucial. The recruit's name, his father's name, the land he owned, his past obligations, each piece of information was dutifully written down, stored for a purpose the recruit could only begin to understand. And then came the mark, a simple, precise stroke of ink, a small symbol that would define him from that moment on. The recruit watched as the scribe's reed moved across the page, his gaze fixed on the smooth flow of ink. That mark, the recruit realized, could change everything. It could erase years of hard work. It could tear apart a life. And it could bind a man to the state in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The scribe's smile was kind, but the recruit could see that the man had no interest in the story of his life. To the scribe, it was just another name, another entry in the long line of people who had been drawn into the state's machinery. There was no sympathy here, only the cold efficiency of the process. The scribe's job, though seemingly simple, held a power the recruit hadn't fully understood until now. Documentation was not just a record, it was a decision, a fate sealed with ink. Some names carried more weight than others. Some families were known for their ability to pay their debts, and others were known for their connections to the temple. These were the unspoken politics of the system, the quiet forces that determined who would be chosen and who would be spared. The recruit's heart tightened as he began to realize that his fate was not entirely his own. There were ways to bend the system to use favors, temple ties, or even debts to escape the draft. But such favors came at a cost. The recruit wasn't sure he had anything left to offer. The quiet nature of the process was perhaps what made it all the more frightening. The scribe never raised his voice. There were no dramatic decisions, no accusations. Everything moved smoothly, effortlessly, as if it were all simply a matter of course. The recruit felt small in the presence of this calm, implacable man. It was terrifying not because the scribe was cruel, but because he wasn't. His indifference made him all the more powerful. He didn't care who the recruit was or what his story was. He only cared about the paper in front of him, the ink, the marks that would decide the recruit's future. The twist, when it came, was as subtle as it was shocking. Some men were taken because their households could not pay. Others were chosen because someone wanted them gone, a rival eager to see them disappear from the village. The recruit realized, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that the draft was not just about the state's needs, it was also about the politics of power, the hidden ways that favors and debts shape decisions. The quiet smile of the scribe was the gateway to something much darker. And then, as if on cue, the scribe finished his work. He looked up at the recruit, his eyes soft yet distant, as if the man before him was no longer a person, but simply a name on a page, a statistic in a column. The recruit stepped away from the desk, feeling the weight of the mark made upon him. He was no longer just a villager. No longer just a man with hopes and dreams, he had become something else, a piece in the state's grand design, an asset to be used, moved, and recorded. As the recruit walked away, the room behind him felt heavier, the air thicker. His status had changed, and in that small, quiet office, he had been transformed from a person into an entry, a line in a ledger. He was now part of the system, and there was no going back. The season had changed, the Nile's floodwaters receding with a slow, predictable grace, leaving behind fertile earth that would nourish the village's crops. But with the floodwaters also came the officials, the men sent by the state to perform a ritual as old as Egypt itself. It was time for the census. The air was thick with tension as the village prepared itself, a strange mix of resignation and defiance hanging in the breeze. They had done this before, year after year, yet the routine never seemed to get easier. The officials arrived like ghosts, their presence barely acknowledged but impossible to ignore. They came with their scrolls and reed pens, with their simple questions and insistent eyes. For the villagers, the census was something to endure, something they pretended had nothing to do with them, even though they knew it was only a matter of time before they were drawn into its web. The recruit walked among the people, a silent observer of the scene unfolding around him. He could see how each household negotiated with the officials, how each man and woman tried to hide what they could, downplaying the number of mouths they fed, the strength of their labor, the value of their livestock. It was a dance of omission and subtle deception, each person trying to protect themselves and their family. A few even whispered in corners, offering up their neighbors' secrets in exchange for their own survival. The village was a place of small betrayals, where trust was stretched thin and survival often depended on who could remain invisible. As the officials moved from home to home, the recruit began to understand the logic behind the census. The state didn't care about the wealth of the people, not in the way the villagers cared about it. What mattered was the labor, the hands that could be called upon to work for the temples, the canals, the fortresses, or the military campaigns. The village might have felt self-sufficient, but the truth was that it was always just a small cog in a much larger machine. The draft, it seemed, wasn't just about war, it was about maintaining that machine. And in a world where every hand was needed, the state took from those who had the least to offer, from those whose absence would not disrupt the delicate balance of village life. But the recruit's understanding deepened with each question the officials asked, each record they made. It wasn't just a matter of who could fight, it was a matter of who could disappear without leaving a gap too wide. The census was not just a tool for finding soldiers. It was a way of identifying who could be spared, who could be taken without the village noticing. Some men were taken because they were seen as expendable, their lives considered less valuable to the community. Others were taken because no one would protest. It was a cruel sort of calculus, one that placed each person into categories of use and disposability. The true twist came when the recruit overheard something he hadn't expected to hear. The census wasn't just for soldiers, it was a net, cast wide, to catch not only those who could serve in battle but also those who had slipped through the cracks of society. The list wasn't only about labor and service, it was about control. It was about tracking the fugitives and debtors, those who had no one to speak for them. It was a way of knowing who had the least to lose and the least to defend them. The recruit began to see the census as a map of power, a way of marking who mattered and who didn't, who could be taken and who could be left behind. The villagers, meanwhile, played their parts, offering up what they could, lying when necessary, hiding what they could. There were those who worked the system, those who paid off the officials, and those who simply kept their heads down and hoped they wouldn't be noticed. But the recruit could feel the tightening web of the state around them, invisible but suffocating. Each answered question seemed to create another question. Each record made another liability. He felt it in the air, this unspoken tension. There was no escaping it. The system was too vast, too efficient. The village, for all its seeming self-sufficiency, was part of something much larger, something that could not be ignored. The recruit realized that the draft wasn't just about finding soldiers, it was about the state finding its subjects, marking them for service, and controlling them through the power of the census. And so, the village danced its quiet dance, pretending nothing had changed, while the officials worked their way through the lists, their reed pens scratching away at the names that would soon become part of Egypt's great machine. The recruit walked among them, the weight of the census heavy on his mind, wondering if he, too, would become just another name on a page. The census moved steadily forward, the officials making their rounds, but now the recruit was seeing the full scope of what it meant to be chosen. The draft, it seemed, was not about fairness or equality, it was about something much more insidious. The subtle, unspoken agreements that held the village together. The villagers did not just offer their labor, they offered their loyalty, their status, their very place in the world, and some of them were better at navigating this system than others. He watched, almost helpless, as a priest's nephew was called upon to serve in the temple. It wasn't that the young man was more physically capable than anyone else. It was that his family had influence, and the temple needed him for reasons the recruit couldn't quite understand. The boy's father offered a humble, almost grateful smile as his son was taken, his hands raised in the ancient gesture of surrender. The recruit noticed that the father's hands weren't shaking. He had been through this before, knew how it worked. He wasn't losing a son, he was offering one to the temple, ensuring his family's place within the sacred hierarchy. The recruit wondered, in the pit of his stomach, whether that was a choice or a trap. Across the square, a craftsman was excused from service, declared indispensable to the village by the officials. His skill was too valuable, too unique to be wasted elsewhere. The craftsman's hands, stained with years of work, gripped the edge of the desk as he nodded gratefully. But the recruit saw it in his eyes, the relief, yes, but also something darker. The craftsman was not free. He was simply kept in place, his work now bound by the state's decree. His value had been recognized, but so had his subjugation. In that moment, the recruit understood. Exemption was not always liberation. It could be a different kind of cage. Nearby, a wealthy family offered grain, a generous donation that would spare them from the draft. The head of the family, an older man with a dignified presence, smiled as he made the transaction. His sons would not be taken, his land would remain protected. The recruit could almost hear the silent promise that passed between them and the officials' protection in exchange for loyalty. A transaction made with the same casual grace as any business deal. The wealthy were not above the draft, but they had ways of ensuring they were not harmed by it. In this world, wealth was not only a shield, it was a key to a different kind of power. The recruit saw the wealth and wondered, could he have protected his own family like that? Or would they, too, be swept up in the tide of duty and obligation? And then there was the poor household. A family with nothing to offer but their own sweat and labor. The man of the house stood before the officials, his face pale, his wife beside him, clutching their children. They had nothing to trade, no connections to call upon, no wealth to shield them. They were just names on a list, faces in a crowd, and the state had already decided that they had nothing of value to give. The recruit watched as the man's shoulders slumped, the weight of the decision crushing him. There was no kindness here, no bargaining, no promise of protection. This family would be torn apart because they had no means to fight back. The unfairness of it all gathered like a storm, and the recruit could see it now in its clearest form. The draft wasn't about who was ready or who was strong. It was about who mattered. It was about power, status, and who had the means to escape the net. Some men were chosen because they were needed, some because they were wanted, and some because they were simply expendable. The draft didn't just gather soldiers, it reinforced the hierarchy. It made sure the same people remained in power, while the same people remained at the bottom. But there was a twist in the way the draft worked, a twist the recruit had not expected. As he continued to watch, he saw that sometimes the exemption was worse than the draft itself. The priest's nephew, the craftsman, and the wealthy family, they weren't being saved. They were being owned. The system didn't free them, it bound them in a different way, tied them to patrons who would always expect something in return. The recruit began to realize that in this world, protection was not a gift. It was a leash, a way of keeping the powerful in control by offering a false sense of security. The lucky ones weren't spared, they were made to serve in a different form. He felt the weight of it settle in his chest as he watched another young man, someone he barely knew, be spared from the draft by a simple nod from the local official. The man's eyes shone with gratitude, but there was something about his posture that made the recruit uneasy. He wasn't free. He was simply caught in a different kind of web. Protection, it seemed, came with its own price. The recruit felt a cold, creeping realization. In this world, there were no real choices, only chains disguised as freedoms. As the day drew to a close, the recruit realized that the system had already marked him. He had been seen, catalogued, and weighed. The only question left was how far he would go, and what it would cost him to keep moving. The road ahead was long, but for some, the road was not the journey, it was the destination. And that destination had already been decided. The sun dipped low over the village, casting a soft golden hue across the land, and the evening's quiet was almost unnerving. In the small home, the recruit moved slowly, mechanically, as if each action had been scripted for him. His mother worked beside him, folding cloth with careful precision, each fold sharp and deliberate, as if she were folding time itself, preserving moments that would soon be lost. Her hands were steady, but there was something in the way she avoided his gaze that spoke volumes. It was as if the finality of this moment was too much to bear, too much to say, so she didn't look up. She didn't have to. His father stood nearby, a shadow against the wall, not quite meeting his son's eyes either. The air between them was thick with something unsaid. The recruit could feel it, this silent understanding that stretched between them like a rope he couldn't cut. His father didn't speak much. There was no need for words. Not now. There was nothing left to say. This was what duty demanded. This was the moment that had been building since the day he was born. He was leaving, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. His younger sibling, a small figure sitting on the edge of the mat, watched him with wide eyes. There was a feigned smile on the child's face, an attempt at bravery that didn't quite reach the eyes. It was the smile of someone who didn't understand, who only saw the departure as another part of the cycle. The recruit gave them a small smile in return, though it felt hollow, like he was pretending to play a part in a story that wasn't his. The preparations were simple. A small bundle, a borrowed knife, a few last possessions that he could carry. These were the tokens that would see him through the next chapter, the items that would define him now. His mother handed him a final piece of cloth, a small talisman, some token of protection, but there was no real comfort in it. It was a gesture, and nothing more. It was as though she knew he wasn't truly leaving to find glory or adventure. He wasn't leaving to make a name for himself. He was leaving because he had no choice. The dinner they shared felt like a ritual, a ceremony without words. It was almost sacred in its way. The food tasted bland, as though the very act of eating had taken on the significance of a farewell. There were no cheers, no promises. There was only the quiet passage of time, slipping away, each bite a reminder of what was being left behind. His father ate, his eyes distant, while his mother focused on her work, as though she were trying to capture every last moment before it slipped from her grasp. And then came the twist, the realization that hit the recruit like a blow to the chest. Some men volunteered for the draft. Not for glory, not for honor, but because it was an escape. They volunteered for the promise of food, wages, and the chance to escape the crushing debts that chained their families to the earth. The draft, it seemed, wasn't just a sentence. It was also a lifeline, a door that swung both ways into danger. Yes, but also into something else. A chance at something more, a chance at survival. The recruit's mind spun with this new knowledge. Was he leaving because he had to? Or was he leaving because, like others before him, he had no better choice? The door to the house creaked as he stepped outside, and the first physical movement of the evening began. The air was cooler now, the river's whisper still present, but now more distant. The village behind him seemed to dissolve into the darkness, swallowed by the road that stretched before him. The weight of his decision hung in the air like the final stroke of a pen. He wasn't just leaving home. He was already losing it. Home was not a place, but a memory. It was something that would stay behind, something he couldn't carry with him on the road ahead. The road was already claiming him, the distance between him and the life he'd known widening with every step. And as he walked, he realized something that chilled him to the bone. The village, in all its quiet simplicity, had already begun to disappear from him. He thought he was leaving home, but the truth was, home was already leaving him. The river still whispered on, as if it had seen this before, 1,000 times. The world around him might change, but some things, like the Nile's steady flow, would continue. The road stretched before him, and it was the only thing that felt real now. The sun beat down mercilessly as the recruit stepped into the muster yard, a space that seemed to exist on the border of two worlds, neither truly home nor truly military. The ground was cracked and dry, the air thick with heat, as a row of strangers stood in silence. Each man carried the same small bundle, each held the same uncertain stare. There was no excitement here, no camaraderie, just a low, anxious hum that filled the yard, a blend of voices too quiet to be comforting, too loud to be ignored. It was a place where nothing was said aloud, but everything was understood. The yard felt like a threshold, a space caught between one world and another. On one side, there was the village, the life he had left behind, where he was someone with a name, with a family. On the other side, there was the unknown, a world where names were irrelevant, where faces were wiped clean of identity, where men became little more than numbers. The recruit's stomach tightened as he realized that his entry into this new world had already begun. He was no longer a son, a brother, or a villager. He was becoming something else. As the officers moved between the men, their eyes flicked over each face, their glances sharp and calculating. There were no words, just gestures, quick, clipped exchanges that told the recruit more than he wanted to know. The scribes stood nearby, their reed pens moving swiftly across papyrus, recording details that seemed meaningless. Names were recited, but they didn't matter. Origins were recorded, but no one cared. The officers inspected the men's bodies as if they were cattle evaluating strength, stamina, and usefulness. Small humiliations became routine. The recruit's heart pounded in his chest, but there was no place to hide. He was just another figure in the line, his individuality slowly being erased with every action, every glance, every mark made on his record. He was told to strip, to stand still, to submit to their scrutiny. His body was not his own anymore. It was part of the machine, something to be measured, tested, and catalogued. As the officers moved from one man to the next, the recruit began to realize the true nature of the system he had entered. This wasn't about finding fighters. This was about finding bodies. The officers weren't concerned with how well he could swing a sword, or how skilled he was with a spear. They weren't asking about his ability to fight. They were asking how far he could go before his body broke. The first shock came when the recruit realized what the officers were looking for. Teeth, feet, endurance. How well could his body withstand the strain of walking? How far could his legs carry him before exhaustion set in? The recruit had imagined that this would be about strength, about battle readiness, but it was nothing like that. It was about distance, about the long, grueling marches that would stretch his body to its limits. He had thought of warfare in terms of glory and courage, of heroic stands and epic victories. But this was something else. This was a test of endurance, of survival. The recruit's legs burned just thinking about it. The officers made their assessments quickly, moving on to the next man with barely a pause. The recruit tried to hold his ground, his back stiff, his feet aching, but there was nothing he could do. The system was in motion, and he was just one more cog. He felt small, insignificant, like a number waiting to be assigned a place. He could already feel his identity slipping away, his name fading into the background as the scribes tallied, the officers nodded, and the decisions were made without a single word addressed to him. The heat pressed down on him, the air growing heavier with each passing minute. He could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that something important was happening just out of reach, something he couldn't fully grasp. The officers moved in and out of his line of sight, exchanging glances, making quiet decisions that didn't involve him but that would shape his future. He was just one of many, and in the end, it was clear. The draft was not about choosing the best, the bravest, or the most skilled. It was about choosing bodies that could endure the long marches, bodies that could be used for the work that lay ahead. The recruit stood in line, his body aching under the scrutiny, his thoughts spinning with the realization that everything he had imagined about this moment was wrong. This wasn't a path to glory. This was a path to exhaustion, to survival, to something far less heroic and far more grueling. He wasn't here to fight, he was here to walk. And the truth of that settled heavily in his chest. His body was not a tool of war, it was just another number in a long line of bodies, all of them destined for the same fate. As he waited, the sounds of the yard became a blur, a constant hum of voices, the shuffle of feet, the rustle of paper. But through it all, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The true test was not whether he could fight, it was whether he could survive the road ahead. The idea of battle, of heroic struggle, had faded into the background. What mattered now was the journey, the distance between this moment and whatever came next. The recruit was beginning to understand that his body, his endurance, was the only thing that would carry him through. And for the first time, he wondered if that would be enough. The induction process was more ritual than function, a carefully orchestrated series of steps designed to strip away the last remnants of individualism. The recruit stood among the others, feeling the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders, the air thick with anticipation. Around him, the men were silent, their faces a mix of curiosity and resignation. They had already learned the first rule of the camp: silence was safer than words. The officers moved like shadows between the rows, their presence commanding but unspoken, as if the mere act of standing before them was enough to instill obedience. First came the oath, a simple promise that felt hollow and heavy at once. Loyalty to Pharaoh, loyalty to the state. The words were easy to say, but the recruit could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken weight behind them. He swore, along with the others. But it was clear that this wasn't about belief. It was about submission. The officers watched with cold, unblinking eyes, and the recruit knew just for a moment that the words meant nothing to them. What mattered was the act of submission itself. Then came the commands, simple but deliberate. Move when told, stand when told, don't question. The recruit could feel the weight of these instructions, their simplicity masking their true power. The officers weren't asking for obedience, they were demanding it. The rules that followed were like chains, invisible but unbreakable. Don't wander, don't fight inside the camp, don't lose your issued gear, don't insult a superior. Each one sounded like a small thing, a detail, but the recruit could sense the threat behind them. A small mistake could lead to punishment. A careless word could cost him dearly. The real revelation came when the recruit watched the officers enforce these rules. Discipline wasn't just about keeping the men in line with beatings or physical force. No, the officers had something far more effective. They used collective punishment. One man's mistake could cost the entire group. The men learned quickly that every action had consequences. If one man lost his gear, the entire group would suffer no rest, no food, until it was found. If one man insulted a superior, the whole group would be punished, forced to endure the same humiliation. It wasn't about physical strength anymore. It was about the fear of making your friends suffer. The recruit felt it settle in his gut. The first weapon they gave him wasn't a spear. It was the knowledge that every step he took, every mistake he made, could cost his group something important. The officers watched, their eyes cold but not unfeeling. They knew exactly what they were doing. Fear was not just something imposed from above, it was distributed horizontally. The men began to watch each other, not just for threats, but for mistakes. The threat wasn't just the officers or the state, it was every other man in the camp. If one of them faltered, they would all feel it. The system was designed to make sure that fear wasn't just an external force. It made each man accountable to everyone else. It turned strangers into watchdogs. And the recruit began to understand that this was the true power of the camp. It wasn't violence that kept them in line, it was the constant, unspoken pressure to protect not just themselves, but each other. The group dynamic began to form almost immediately, each man sizing up the others, testing the boundaries of loyalty and fear. Some men kept their distance, others sought to befriend those with more influence. It wasn't about alliances or camaraderie, it was about survival. If you could make the others trust you, you might avoid the worst of the punishment. If you made a mistake, you might find yourself alone, the weight of collective punishment bearing down on you with an intensity that felt almost physical. The recruit could feel the shift in the air, the tension was thick. And it wasn't just coming from the officers, it was coming from the men around him. The fear was contagious, a silent current that ran through the camp, binding them all together. It wasn't the fear of battle, or the fear of being caught, but the fear of losing control, the fear of making a mistake that would cost everyone. And in that fear, the recruit saw the true power of the system. It didn't need to be violent, it only needed to be constant. As the officers finished their rounds, and the men began to settle into their new roles, the recruit couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for him to become like the others. How long before he too began to watch every move, every word, with the same calculating eye. He felt the pressure growing, the weight of the collective responsibility already settling on his shoulders. There was no escape from it, not for him, not for anyone. And with that thought, the fear began to solidify, becoming a part of him in a way that felt as inevitable as the march ahead. The group was formed now, each man bound to the others by something much deeper than the rules they had been given. It was the threat of punishment, yes, but more than that, it was the fear of being the one who made a mistake, and that fear would follow them every step of the way. The sun was already high by the time the recruit and the others began their training. The first lesson was simple: carry. They were given loads, heavy bundles wrapped in rough cloth, too heavy for comfort, and told to march. The heat pressed down like a weight, each step a reminder of the relentless sun, the dust swirling around their feet. The recruit's throat was dry, and the gritty dust clung to his skin, sticking like salt, making every breath feel heavy, almost suffocating. The sound of sandals slapping against the earth was the only noise, steady, rhythmic, and somehow unbearably loud in the silence of the heat. They moved in unison, the men falling into a rhythm, their bodies creaking under the strain, but still, they kept moving. The officers barked commands, and the men obeyed not with precision, but with instinct, their bodies learning to move together. The rhythm of the march became a kind of language, a shared understanding that didn't need words. Every step, every turn, was part of something bigger, part of a machine that moved without question. The recruit began to feel the weight of what he was learning. It wasn't just about carrying loads, it was about endurance. The soldiers who had been here longer moved with ease, their bodies accustomed to the strain. They knew how to balance the load on their shoulders, how to conserve energy, how to adjust their posture to make the weight bearable. The veterans moved with a kind of quiet authority, their experience showing in the way they held their heads high, the way they never faltered, even when the heat seemed unbearable. But the recruit was still learning the basics. There were no heroic speeches, no grand gestures of courage. The officers didn't talk about battle, at least not yet. They talked about logistics, how to carry, how to pack, how to build a camp, and how to move without dying from negligence. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what he had imagined. There was no swordplay, no glory, just the slow, grinding reality of survival. They dug latrines, built temporary shelters, and learned how to keep water from spoiling. Every task was necessary, every detail important. The recruit was struck by how little of this had to do with fighting. This was the true cost of being a soldier, these tasks. The unseen work that kept everything running smoothly. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also laborers, constantly moving, constantly working, constantly enduring. The officers made it clear they weren't interested in who could swing a sword the best. They wanted to know who could endure, who could handle the weight of the load, who could keep going when the world seemed determined to break them. The recruit's body ached, his muscles burned, and his mind struggled to keep up with the constant demand for attention to detail. There was no room for mistakes here. One misstep, one lapse in concentration, could result in a disaster, a lost piece of gear, a forgotten task, a delay in the march. And then came the realization that cut through everything. The true enemy wasn't another army, wasn't a rival nation or a band of marauders. It was distance. It was thirst. It was time. The enemy was not a battle that could be won with a weapon. It was the slow, grinding force of exhaustion, the constant pressure of survival. The recruit began to understand the importance of endurance in a way he hadn't before. It wasn't about fighting. It was about surviving long enough to even see a fight. As they marched, the sun climbed higher, the heat more oppressive, the dust more suffocating. The air seemed to ripple with the weight of the day, but still, they moved forward, step by step. The recruit's body screamed with every movement, but he kept going. There was no choice but to endure. It wasn't about battle. Not yet. It was about learning how to keep moving when everything in you told you to stop. The officers kept talking about battle, but all day, the recruit learned how to carry, how to endure, how to survive the unglamorous reality of what it meant to be a soldier. When the day finally ended, the men were exhausted, their bodies aching and their spirits drained. They were given little rest, only the promise of more to come. There was no respite in sight, only the slow, unrelenting grind of training. And as the recruit settled into the dust, his body already heavy with the weight of the day, he realized that the true cost of being a soldier wasn't the battle, it was everything that came before it. And everything that came before it was just a test of how long you could endure. The sun seemed to rise earlier every day, its light turning the earth beneath their feet into a furnace before the drills even began. The call to rise came at dawn, an order that hung in the air, harsh and immediate. No one complained. They simply moved, some groggy, others already alert, but all of them knowing that this was the beginning of another day that would blend into the one before it. The routine was endless, its pattern a slow, grinding loop that wore at the edges of each man's mind. It didn't matter if they were ready or not. The call came, and they responded. Every movement conditioned to be automatic. The drills themselves were simple, almost deceptively so: line up, march, turn, nothing complicated. But with every misstep, there were consequences. Someone's legs gave out under the heat, and they were left panting in the dust, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Another man's feet, already torn from days of marching, began to split, blood mingling with the dirt, yet he kept walking, too afraid to stop. A third tried to crack a joke, but the laughter died in his throat as an officer's glare silenced him instantly. There was no room for humor, no room for weakness. There was only the grind of the routine, a machine that cared nothing for personal pain. The officers stood like statues, their eyes scanning for flaws, their voices like a whip whenever they found one. They didn't shout for the sake of anger. They shouted to break the men down, to mold them into something else. The recruit's body ached, his muscles screaming from the strain. But there was something else happening too, something he hadn't expected. It wasn't just his body that was being reshaped. It was his mind. The officers weren't teaching them to think, they were teaching them to respond, to move in unison, to obey without hesitation. The recruit learned quickly. At first, his mind fought against the orders. the repetitive nature of the commands, the constant strain of doing the same things over and over. But with each failure, he began to change. He started to move like the others, in sync with the group. His body learned to hold a line, to turn as one, even when his instincts screamed at him to run. He didn't want to follow orders. He wanted to think, to act on his own. But as the days wore on, he realized that this wasn't the point. The point wasn't to be clever. The point was to be reliable, predictable. The officers didn't care about bravery or intelligence. They didn't want soldiers who would think on their feet, who would improvise. They wanted soldiers who would do exactly what they were told, when they were told, without question. The system was built on predictability, on the ability to replicate the same action over and over without variation. It wasn't about valor. It was about obedience. And with each drill, with each failure, the recruit felt a part of himself slipping away. He was no longer the boy who had dreamed of battle and glory. He was becoming just another cog in the machine. Every day, he got stronger, his body hardening, his movements smoother, his reflexes more precise, but every day, he also became easier to replace. The harder he worked, the more he conformed, the less he felt like himself. The idea of individuality had no place here. The state didn't care who he was. It only cared about what he could do, and what he could do was simple: obey. His identity, once a distinct thing, began to fade into the sameness of the others. The more he improved, the more he blended in. He thought he had joined the army to become something greater, to prove himself, to make a name for himself. But as the drills dragged on, he realized that this was not about self-actualization. It was about uniformity. The group didn't need heroes. The group needed workers. Workers who could march in perfect formation, who could hold their line, who could move without hesitation, without thought. And as he stood there, his feet aching, his body drenched in sweat, the recruit couldn't help but wonder, was this what he had signed up for? The truth gnawed at him as the officers barked more commands, the endless cycle of drills continuing like the turning of a wheel. Every day, his muscles grew stronger, his discipline tighter, but every day, he lost a little more of himself. His body was becoming the perfect machine, but was it worth it? Would he ever be able to find himself again, or had the army already taken him? As the sun beat down on the field, the answer felt more uncertain than ever. The more he trained, the more he realized that the real battle wasn't against an enemy army. It was against the slow erosion of everything he used to be. The recruit's days blurred together as he was assigned to labor that had nothing to do with the grand, heroic battles he had imagined. There were no weapons to wield, no enemies to fight, only endless tasks that felt strangely far removed from the idea of military service. Instead of practicing with a spear, he found himself hauling stone under the scorching sun, carrying heavy loads that scraped at his already aching muscles. He was assigned to repair embankments, clear canals, and reinforce storehouses, tasks that felt more like the work of common laborers than soldiers. The heat pressed down on him as he shoveled dirt into trenches, his hands raw from lifting rocks and stone. There was no glory in this work, only the weariness of repetition. But the deeper truth was harder to ignore. Each stone he lifted felt like a rehearsal for carrying wounded men. Each trench he dug seemed to resemble a grave. The work, while mundane, was also a reminder of the delicate balance Egypt relied on. Organized manpower not just to fight, but to protect the harvests, to maintain the infrastructure, to project royal power into the very landscape of the kingdom. The Nile might bring life to the land, but it was the labor of men that kept it flowing. The recruit began to see that this was the other side of the army, a side that didn't fight wars but kept the kingdom running. The true weight of his service hit him when he realized that for many of the men, this was the service. The expectation of battle was only a possibility, a distant goal. What they were truly drafted for was hard labor months, spent working under military discipline with no guarantee that they would ever see a battlefield. The recruit's mind wrestled with this shift in understanding. He had been promised battle, glory, honor, but instead he was buried in the daily grind of maintenance, of building and repairing things that would never belong to him. He was shaping Egypt's future, but he had no stake in it. Another revelation came quietly, like a stone dropping into a well. Soldiers, he now realized, could be stationed to guard grain, to escort tax shipments, or to patrol borders. They weren't just tools for war, they were instruments of domestic control. The military wasn't just about conquering foreign lands, it was about enforcing the state's will, ensuring that Egypt's wealth and resources stayed in the right hands, that the people stayed in line. The recruit had thought that by joining the army, he was stepping into a world of battle and heroism. But what he found was that he had been drafted into a much larger machine, one that moved not with swords and spears, but with the slow, grinding force of discipline and control. He thought the army would teach him how to kill, how to be a warrior. Instead, it taught him how to build, how to maintain, and how to serve a power that would never see him as anything more than a cog in its vast machinery. Each stone he carried, each trench he dug, reinforced the weight of his new reality. He wasn't here to fight for glory. He was here to work, to create and protect something that didn't belong to him, something that had already been claimed by a distant, unyielding power. The army wasn't about heroism. It was about making sure the system kept running, making sure the state's grip on the land and its people remained tight. As the days stretched on, the recruit felt the growing disconnect between what he had hoped for and what he was actually doing. The work wasn't what he had imagined, but it was necessary. And in that necessity lay a quiet, unsettling truth. The state's control over its people didn't come from the threat of war alone. It came from the labor, from the constant need to maintain the empire, from the everyday tasks that kept everything in place. The military wasn't just about conquest, it was about control, about keeping the kingdom's wheels turning, no matter the cost to the men who powered them. Issuance day arrived with the weight of ceremony. The lines were long, stretching across the dusty yard, each man standing shoulder to shoulder with his comrades, waiting for the moment when they would finally receive the equipment that marked them as soldiers. There was an almost reverent hush as the bundles were handed out: spears, shields, and sometimes bows, each item wrapped in rough cloth, each piece an official declaration that they were now part of something larger than themselves. For the first time, the recruit felt the tangible weight of it all: the spear in his hand, the shield slung over his shoulder, the faint promise of power that these simple tools seemed to offer. The gear wasn't much: basic, functional, and unremarkable. The shields were wooden, simple things that had seen better days, patched up with strips of leather. The spears were sturdy, but not finely crafted. The bows were even rarer, and only a few men received them. Armor was reserved for the elites, for those who had proven themselves in some way, or for specialized troops who had particular duties. The rest of the soldiers, like the recruit, had only what they could carry, and it was clear that the state gave only what it deemed necessary. The equipment was sufficient to defend and to fight, but it wasn't designed to make anyone feel invincible. It was a tool, nothing more. But there was something else. The gear was worn. The wood of the shields had marks of previous use, the leather cracked and patched. The spears had been through countless battles, the tips dulled with time. The recruit realized that much of the equipment was recycled, repaired, and handed down from previous campaigns. These tools had a history, an unspoken legacy of battles fought and men who had come before. It was a strange thing to think about. Each scratch, each dent in the wood and leather, was a reminder that these objects had seen the cost of war, had been used, discarded, and reused, just like the men who would now carry them. The equipment wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of debt. The recruit learned quickly that losing issued gear could bring punishment or debt. A missing shield wasn't just an inconvenience. It could mean a fine, or worse, a deduction from the meager rations the soldiers received. Suddenly, the shield didn't feel like a piece of protection, it felt like something he owed, a debt hanging over his head. He could no longer view it as just an object. It was now part of the state system, something that could be used to control him, to bind him to the larger machinery of the empire. Rations were issued next, a reminder of the state's other method of control. Grain, beer, and dried food were handed out in equal portions to each man. The grain was the base, the staple that kept them alive. The beer, thin and sour, was meant to dull the edge of hunger and fatigue. The dried food was less palatable, but it was filling. The rations, however, weren't just for survival. They were a tool of control. The recruit realized that while the state could feed him, it could also starve him into submission. If he failed to follow the rules, if he lost his equipment or acted out of line, the state could simply withhold his rations. A soldier's survival was tied not just to his skill in battle, but to his obedience, to his ability to follow the strictures laid out before him. The recruit looked down at his shield again, feeling its weight against his shoulder. It was no longer just a piece of equipment, it was a symbol of something much larger, something much more dangerous. It was something the state could use to punish him, to control him. And with that realization came the uncomfortable truth. The shield was not just protection, it was a debt he would carry, a reminder that everything he had, even his life, was held by the will of the state. As the men filed away with their gear, the mood was somber, the reality of their situation settling in. The equipment, once a symbol of their newfound power, now felt like another chain, another way the state could bind them. And as the recruit walked away, the weight of the shield on his back seemed heavier than ever before. The state had given him a weapon, yes, but it had also given him a debt that would follow him until the very end. The state could feed him, could sustain him, but it could also take that sustenance away with a single word. And in that quiet power, the recruit saw the true cost of being a soldier. The question now was not if he would fight, but how long he could survive under the weight of it all. The weight of the recruit's kit settled over him like a slow, inevitable burden, each part of it digging into his skin and spirit in ways he hadn't anticipated. It started small, a chafing strap here, an awkward fold there, but by the afternoon, it had grown into something unrelenting. The leather of his sandals rubbed against his feet, each step a reminder of how much distance the body had to cover, how much pressure it had to endure. At first, the recruit had imagined the gear as an extension of himself, something that would make him feel invincible. But it didn't feel that way. Instead, it was a constant, aching presence. The spear, while a symbol of power, quickly became cumbersome. The longer he carried it, the more it felt like a foreign object, something he had to adjust to, rather than something that adjusted to him. The world around him started to shift as the kit became a part of his body. Strangers no longer looked at him like the boy who had left his village, they looked at him like a soldier. It wasn't respect they saw in his eyes, but something more calculated. The spear made him a target for scrutiny, a figure marked by authority, whether he wanted it or not. Every time he moved through the camp or the streets, he felt the eyes of those around him. The spear didn't make him feel powerful. It made him feel exposed. A man who had to live up to the weapon he carried. But it wasn't just the spear that mattered in the army. As he observed the specialized roles within the ranks, the recruit saw how each role had its own set of tools, its own hierarchy of importance. The archers, the spearmen, the charioteers, and the boat crews all had their own distinct gear, but each was also tied to a different function. The archers, nimble and skilled, carried quivers of arrows and longbows that demanded both precision and speed. The charioteers had their horses and specialized harnesses, while the boat crews, who worked the Nile's waters, carried their own set of unique equipment. But none of these roles seemed as constant or as essential as the foot soldiers, those who carried the heavy load, who walked long distances, who stood in line when needed. They were the most numerous, the least celebrated, and the least romantic. The recruit, now realizing his place in the ranks, came to understand that the most basic pieces of his kit were the most important. The sandals, for example, were more vital than any weapon. A foot soldier could survive without a spear, but not without his sandals. They were the only thing keeping him on his feet, the only thing keeping him from being left behind by the slow march of time and terrain. Water containers became sacred. The officers guarded them with the same reverence they gave their own weapons, understanding that without water, a soldier's body could turn against him in hours and his life could be drained just as quickly. The simple cloak, which seemed insignificant at first, became a lifesaver when the cold night crept in, biting at the skin after a long day of marching. It was the smallest things he had never considered back in the village, that now defined his survival. But survival wasn't just about the tools. It was about the system that governed the soldiers' lives. And the more the recruit learned, the more he saw how fragile that system was. Pay, he learned, was rarely regular. Promises of wages could be delayed for months, sometimes longer. The issue wasn't just that there were logistical delays, it was that the records of payments often got lost. The money often didn't make it through the supply chain, or the officers simply didn't bother to pay. It was easy to see how a soldier could go without what was promised. Sometimes, the state's promises didn't arrive at all. The irregularity of pay meant that soldiers were often left living off their rations alone, which was sometimes insufficient, depending on where they were stationed. This introduced a new reality for the recruit. The army wasn't just a dangerous place, it was a financially unstable one. The promises of wealth, the hope for regular pay, were nothing more than empty words in many cases. The rations, while life-sustaining, became a kind of currency, and their unpredictability became another form of control. The state could feed a man, could sustain him, but it could also withhold that sustenance and break him without a single drop of blood being spilled. Hunger, or the threat of hunger, became a weapon. A soldier's obedience could be bought with bread, but it could also be shattered by the absence of it. The more the recruit saw of the system, the less certain he was of what he had joined. The gear, while necessary for survival, was nothing more than a tool of the state, something that could be taken away or withheld, just like his pay or his rations. The army, despite its imposing appearance, seemed to run on a fragile economy, one that could be disrupted by the slightest shift in the supply chain, by corruption, or by the simple inefficiency of a vast system. With each passing day, the recruit's understanding of the army deepened. He no longer saw himself as a hero, armed with his spear, marching off to fight in some grand campaign. Instead, he saw himself as part of a much larger machine, one that could grind to a halt at any moment, one that depended on the careful management of resources, the steady flow of supplies. The system could promise protection and power, but it could also strip those things away in the blink of an eye. The shield on his back no longer felt like a source of protection. It felt like another thing he was being held accountable for, another thing the state could take away if he didn't play by its rules. The recruit realized, as he adjusted the weight of his gear, that the state had given him not just a weapon to defend the kingdom, but a system that could break him if he stepped out of line. And in that quiet, unseen power, the power of withholding, of starving into obedience, he saw the true force of the state. It wasn't just in the sword or the spear. It was in the ration, the record, the supply chain that kept the entire system alive. And the more he learned, the more he understood. The true weapon the state wielded wasn't just physical, it was economic. And it was a weapon that could break him just as easily as any blade. The recruit's world began to shrink down to one pressing concern: food. As the days wore on, he realized that survival in the army wasn't just about strength, endurance, or discipline. It was about the steady flow of grain and the people who controlled it. The army didn't march on swords and spears. It marched on grain, the lifeblood of the soldiers, and it passed through too many hands to stay honest. The grain wasn't just food, it was power. But power, he soon learned, had a way of becoming corrupted, a silent, invisible force that shaped the army more than the enemy ever could. The grain started its journey in the storehouses, massive structures filled with precious reserves meant to feed the army. From there, it was loaded onto boats, carried down the Nile's winding course to the army's camps, where it would sustain the men through the endless days of labor and travel. The Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, was more than just a river, it was the artery that kept the army moving. The waterway connected the entire country, coursing grain, supplies, and men along its length, like a great, unbroken vein. But the journey of grain wasn't a smooth one. The recruits soon found that the delivery of food wasn't as certain as it seemed. There were delays, mistakes, even outright failures. The stomachs of the men became the ticking clock of the army. If the grain didn't arrive on time, everything stopped, discipline fractured. The soldiers, exhausted and starving, turned into a dangerous force, their tempers as unpredictable as the heat that scorched the land. A late delivery didn't just mean hunger, it meant the collapse of order, the unraveling of the fragile discipline that kept them in line. The officers, too, understood this fragile balance. They feared nothing more than an empty storehouse, and the thought of their soldiers going hungry was a threat that could unravel everything. It wasn't the enemy's arrows that kept them up at night, it was the grain, the deliveries, the fear that the supply chain might break, and the soldiers would turn on them in desperation. Tactics, the officers knew, were secondary to logistics. The army could be defeated by a lack of food just as easily as by a lack of men. And it wasn't just the logistics of supply that made the system fragile, it was the corruption that ran through it, hidden in plain sight. The recruit learned quickly that the grain that made it to the camp was never quite as pure as it should be. The rations were often shaved, portions reduced to save a few coins. The beer that was meant to sustain them was watered down, its strength diluted so much that it barely offered any comfort after a long, grueling day. The officials responsible for handling the supplies, those who controlled the grain, the beer, and the rations, were not above taking their share. The theft wasn't a scandal. It was part of the system, a constant background risk that everyone knew about, but few dared to acknowledge. The army marched on grain, but the grain often passed through too many hands to stay honest. Starvation, the recruit realized, was not a natural disaster. It was not an accident. Sometimes, it was a decision made far away from the camp, made by those who were too high up to care about the suffering of the men on the ground. The decision to withhold grain, to cut corners, to steal it, was a choice made by those in power, not by the circumstances. And in that realization, the recruit's world began to shift. The true danger wasn't just the enemy waiting beyond the horizon. The true danger was in the system itself, a system built on fragile promises and the constant threat of scarcity. The recruit's stomach twisted, and with it, a new understanding began to form. The hunger wasn't just something he would have to endure. It was a tool, a weapon used by those in charge to maintain control. And every time a man went hungry, every time a ration was withheld, it was a reminder that the army was not a place of security. It was a place where survival depended on the whim of those who controlled the grain. As he stood in line, waiting for his meager portion, the recruit felt the weight of it all. The army wasn't just a place of military discipline, it was a place of economic manipulation, where food, the most basic of human needs, was used as both a reward and a punishment. The men were given their rations, but the rations could be taken away, and the army could break them with hunger just as easily as it could break them with force. The real battle, the recruit realized, wasn't just against the enemy, it was against the system, against the quiet, unseen forces that shaped their lives. And the first enemy he had to face wasn't on the battlefield, it was the grain, the supply, the constant, fragile thread that held the army together. If that thread snapped, everything would fall apart. The first official march began with an almost oppressive quiet. The army stretched out across the land, a column of bodies moving in rhythm, the silence broken only by the soft shuffling of sandals against the earth. There was no fanfare, no music, no call to arms, just the steady, unrelenting sound of footsteps. The recruit felt the weight of the march settle onto his shoulders, but the pace didn't slow. Men moved in order, as if they had practiced this thousands of times before. The rhythm of the column was almost hypnotic, each step bringing them closer to some distant destination, yet no closer to understanding why they were here in the first place. The pace was set by the officers, and no one was allowed to fall behind. If you did, the penalties were clear. A man who lagged too far risked punishment, mockery, or worse, being left behind entirely. There was no room for weakness here. Every soldier was expected to move with the group no matter the cost. The silent competition to remain unfazed by the growing aches and pains of the journey began almost immediately. Blisters formed on the recruit's feet after the first few hours, the raw skin rubbing against his sandals. But still, he kept moving, watching the others around him for signs of weakness. He could feel the pressure building not just physically, but socially. To fall behind was to admit that you couldn't keep up, that you weren't strong enough. The heat bore down on them, merciless, unrelenting. Sweat stung his eyes, and his throat felt like sandpaper. The sun seemed to hang in the sky forever, pushing them forward at a pace that felt too fast for the heavy loads they carried, too slow for the growing tension in the pit of the recruit's stomach. The distance stretched out before them like an endless ribbon, each step taking them further away from the life they had known. The thought of a destination became less important as the reality of the march set in. The only thing that mattered was surviving the next step. As the day wore on, the column began to thin. Some men staggered, while others struggled to keep their rhythm, their bodies already beginning to break down under the strain. The social stakes of the march became clear. Anyone who couldn't keep up, anyone who faltered, became a potential target for ridicule. The group didn't wait for stragglers. The march was an unforgiving test of endurance, and the price for failure was steep. The sun finally began to dip below the horizon, and the recruits, exhausted and barely able to move, began to make camp. It was then that the true weight of the march revealed itself. The transformation of empty land into a temporary home. The men worked quickly but without joy, setting up tents and fires, organizing gear in the dimming light. They had moved from emptiness to structure, but there was no sense of triumph, only the quiet exhaustion of having survived another day. The air cooled, but the ache in the recruit's body remained, a constant reminder of the cost of the march. The true danger of the journey, the recruit learned, wasn't just the enemies they might face, it was the journey itself. Death didn't wait for the battlefield. It came early, in the form of dehydration, infections, snake bites, and accidents. The men didn't speak of it, but the constant risk was there, hanging over each step they took. The heat could kill them. The weight of their packs could kill them. The simple act of walking in this unrelenting heat could kill them. Many died before they even saw a fight, their bodies worn down by the miles, by the sun, by the exhaustion that seemed to settle into their bones like a disease. The recruit began to understand that war started long before the enemy appeared. The fight wasn't just for glory, and it wasn't just about who could swing a sword the hardest. It was about survival, about enduring the unrelenting grind of the march, the heat and the distance. By nightfall, the stars hung over the camp like silent witnesses to their struggle. The sky was beautiful, vast and clear, but the ground beneath them was hard and unforgiving. The recruit lay on the earth, staring up at the stars, feeling the weight of the journey already pressing on his chest. How could something so quiet, so peaceful, be the prelude to something so violent? How could this slow, grinding march be the beginning of war? The calmness of the night only made the tension grow. The peacefulness of the stars above felt like an eerie contrast to the exhaustion below. The recruits were mere shadows against the land, the sound of their breathing filling the empty spaces between the stars. There was no fanfare here, no glory. There was only the slow, inevitable march towards something they didn't yet understand. A place where their bodies would be tested and, for some, broken. The battlefield was still a distant thought, but the recruit understood now. The march itself was already killing men. As the days dragged on, the army became more than just a collection of men moving in rhythm. It became a machine, each soldier another part of the whole, moving not out of individual desire, but out of the necessity of being part of something larger. Boredom began to settle in, an almost unbearable weight that turned into irritability as the miles stretched endlessly before them. The march, once full of the promise of adventure, now felt like an unending treadmill. The monotony seeped into every conversation, every glance. The heat seemed less oppressive, but the constant forward movement made the day feel like it would never end. Silence, which had initially been a form of discipline, soon became something else. It became a breeding ground for rumor. Soldiers who had once avoided each other now whispered in corners, seeking solace in shared uncertainty. The quiet was deafening, broken only by the occasional murmur or the sharp bark of a command. The camp itself, when they made it to a temporary halt, became an ecosystem of nervous energy. Ration lines formed, the men exchanging glances as they waited for their meager portions. Conversations started, but always in low voices, cautious, as if every word might attract the wrong attention. The veterans, silent and seemingly immune to the discomforts, quietly mended their gear, fixing what had been broken or worn down by the endless march. They didn't speak much, but their actions spoke volumes. They had learned to endure without asking questions, without looking for answers. The recruit observed how friendships formed quickly in this environment, born out of necessity rather than trust. Time felt compressed by the shared hardship, the dangers of the journey, the exhaustion, the heat. They bound the men together in ways that were immediate and visceral. What might have taken months to develop in another life was forged in days here. A glance, a shared laugh over a grueling task, became a bond, a small but necessary anchor in the storm of uncertainty. But even these bonds were fragile, held together not by understanding, but by survival. Yet, there was something else beneath the surface, something more unsettling. The soldiers rarely knew the full plan. Their commanders, those distant figures who gave orders and moved in the background, managed fear with controlled information. The men were told only what they needed to hear to keep them moving, to keep their spirits from flagging. It wasn't that the commanders were malicious, it was that uncertainty, the absence of the full picture, was a tool. Fear could be as much a weapon as discipline, and the less the soldiers knew, the more manageable that fear became. The recruit began to understand that uncertainty wasn't just a flaw in the system, it was part of the design. It kept the soldiers in motion, kept them from thinking too much about what lay ahead, or more importantly, what lay behind. They didn't know the full picture, and that was by design. They knew only the next step, and that was enough to keep them moving forward. As he lay in the makeshift camp that evening, the recruit could sense the ever-present tension in the air. No one spoke openly about it, but it was there, in the way men watched the officers, in the way conversations faltered when a higher-ranking soldier walked past. The army wasn't just about physical endurance, it was about managing the mind, controlling the thoughts of the men, guiding them without ever letting them realize they were being guided. The scariest thing wasn't what they were marching toward. It was how little anyone was allowed to know. The idea of marching toward an unknown goal, with only fragmented pieces of information, was beginning to eat at the recruit. But it wasn't just the lack of knowledge, it was the realization that this lack of clarity was a tactic. The soldiers weren't meant to know everything. They weren't meant to have all the answers. They were meant to stay focused on the immediate, to think only about the next step, the next ration, the next night's camp. And with every night, with every step, the mystery deepened. The recruit wondered if he'd ever know why he was truly marching, if he'd ever be told what the end goal was, or if the end goal mattered at all. He knew one thing for certain: the fear of not knowing had already begun to eat away at the edges of his resolve. The stars above seemed more distant now, no longer a comfort but a reminder of how far they had come and how much farther they had to go. The quiet was oppressive, each night falling without answers, each day beginning with the same uncertainty. And as the recruit tried to sleep beneath the blanket of stars, the weight of the silence pressed in. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of control, of fear kept at bay by not knowing, by not asking. In the darkness, as the camp settled, the recruit realized that this march, this endless march, was more than just a physical journey. It was a journey of the mind, and the real danger was not just what lay ahead, but what they weren't allowed to know. The camp, for the most part, felt deceptively calm, a fragile semblance of order held together by the weight of routine. But it only took one small mistake for that calm to fracture. A missing tool, A stolen ration, a whispered insult, minor infractions that would go unnoticed in most places. But here, in this machine of bodies and rules, they were dangerous sparks. The tension was always there, just beneath the surface. A quiet hum that no one acknowledged but everyone felt. When one breach occurred, it wasn't just an isolated event. It was the first crack in the dam. The camp knew this, everyone knew this. If one soldier faltered, if one soldier broke the fragile order, it invited others to do the same. The consequences weren't just about punishment, they were about maintaining the illusion of control. The officers didn't wait. They responded swiftly and decisively, without hesitation. A theft, a mistake, these weren't just offenses, they were threats to the entire system. Punishment wasn't always physical. In fact, it rarely was. Physical pain could be endured, but the punishments designed for the men in the camp were subtler, more insidious. A man might be isolated, forced to work alone at the worst hours, with no rest and little company. His fellow soldiers might be made to watch, their eyes filled with the silent weight of their own complicity. The worst punishment, however, wasn't labor or deprivation. It was humiliation. Forced to stand before the others, stripped of pride, made to feel small and insignificant, it was designed not just to punish, but to break something deeper. It was a punishment meant to erase pride, to remind them that in this place they were nothing more than tools, easily discarded when no longer useful. But it wasn't just the soldiers' discipline that was at stake, it was the army's relationship with the world it had conquered. Soldiers were sometimes tasked with policing civilians in these conquered areas, and the role, while it might seem innocent enough, had a subtle but corrosive effect. The recruits saw it in the way soldiers treated the villagers, how fear and suspicion replaced empathy. It was easier to turn to aggression than to show compassion, and in the end, aggression felt safer. The soldiers were encouraged to see the civilians as other, as potential threats rather than human beings. This shift was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there, in the way the soldiers spoke to the villagers, in the way they handled them with suspicion, in the way they grew more and more comfortable with cruelty. The recruit realized that cruelty could be taught quietly, like a habit. It didn't have to be loud or violent to be effective. It could be as simple as an offhand remark, an ordered action, or a refusal to see a person as anything more than a problem to be managed. Slowly, the soldiers learned to shut off their empathy, to ignore the humanity of others, and in doing so, they learned obedience, not just to their commanders, but to the system that demanded it. The true cost of discipline was starting to become clear to the recruit. Obedience wasn't just about following orders, it was about sleepwalking through moral boundaries, allowing the system to grind them down so completely that they could no longer see the damage they were causing. And as the recruit watched, he began to understand that discipline wasn't just about keeping the soldiers in line. It was about shaping their minds, slowly eroding their sense of right and wrong, until they no longer questioned the cruelty they were asked to inflict. The camp remained quiet in the wake of the punishment, but the silence was different now. It wasn't peace, it was the calm before something darker. The soldiers had been reminded of the cost of disobedience, reminded of what happened when the smallest mistake threatened to unravel the fragile thread that held them together. In that moment, the recruit felt the true weight of the army's power, not just its ability to fight, but its ability to break its own. The scariest thing wasn't the enemy waiting on the horizon. It was the army itself, and the way it could hurt its own faster than any enemy ever could. To Hausen Prophet, the landscape began to shift as the army moved further from the familiar shores of the Nile, and with that change came a subtle but undeniable sense of unease. The air grew heavier, and the once comforting smell of the river faded, replaced by unfamiliar scents that clung to the soldiers' clothing and skin. The steady rhythm of the Nile, the pulse of life that had governed everything the recruit had known, slipped from the army's consciousness. In its place was the growing realization that they were entering unknown territory, where the language, the customs, and the people were not only different, but at times unsettling. The recruit's eyes flicked nervously over the strange sights, trying to piece together a world that felt increasingly foreign with each passing mile. The further the army traveled, the more the distinctions between Egypt and the lands they were marching through became apparent. Egypt's territories stretched north into the Levant, where the land was harsher, the people more diverse, and the stakes higher. To the south, toward Nubia, the landscape was different still, the borders blurring between Egypt's power and the fiercely independent cultures that inhabited the region. As the army moved into these areas, the recruit's sense of identity began to shift. He had always thought of Egypt as an empire, strong and unchallenged. But now he understood that these borders were far from stable. They were living things, constantly in flux, defined not just by geography but by the complex web of trade, loyalty, and conflict. But the real revelation came when the recruit began to understand that the enemy was not always a distant, foreign force. The threat could come from within. Rebels, rival claimants to the throne, border communities that might be allies one year and enemies the next. These were the true dangers. The line between us and them wasn't as firm as he had assumed. The traders who came to Egypt's markets might, at any moment, become adversaries. The farmers who sold grain to the empire could be caught up in revolt, choosing to side with those who threatened Egypt's rule. The recruit's world began to tilt, as the idea of enemy forces clearly defined and separated from the familiar faded into a more unsettling reality. The threat was not always a monster on the horizon. It could be a neighbor, a merchant, someone who had once seemed safe, but who now stood on the other side of a shifting line. This new understanding gnawed at him as the army continued its march. He expected to fight monstrous enemies, foreign invaders with clear faces and dark intentions. Instead, he learned that the true enemy was often more complicated, less easily identifiable. It was a former ally, a friend turned traitor, a borderland community caught between loyalty and opportunity. The boundaries of conflict were less like lines on a map and more like shifting tides, unpredictable and ever-changing. One evening, as the army made camp, the quiet stillness was interrupted by the return of scouts. They had been gone for hours, and their return immediately shifted the camp's mood. The officers, who had been moving with their usual efficiency, now became tense, their voices low and clipped. There was an urgency in the air that had not been there before. The men stood straighter, their eyes darting to the officers as they awaited instructions, the routine of the march suddenly giving way to something more dangerous, more uncertain. The recruit's heart began to race as he watched the officers exchange hurried words, the tension thickening around the campfire. The familiar sounds of camp life, the crackling of fires, the murmur of voices grew muted, as if the land itself was holding its breath. For the first time, the recruit felt the shift from routine to readiness. There was no announcement, no grand speech. It was in the subtle change of tone, the way the officers moved, the way the men quieted themselves without a word. The march had stopped being just a march. It had become something more. And as the recruit stood there, waiting for orders, he realized that this was no longer about the journey. It was about what came next. The first true test of his training. The tension in the air grew thick, and the recruit's mind raced. What was ahead? Who were they going to face? For the first time, he understood that the true danger lay not in the enemy on the horizon, but in the uncertainty that could change everything in an instant. The enemy, it seemed, was not always someone who stood at a distance. Sometimes, it was someone who had once sold you grain in the morning. In Deby, the clash came without warning, a sudden eruption of chaos that shattered the rhythm of the march. One moment, the army was moving forward in tense but steady formation, and the next, it was swallowed by confusion. There were no dramatic lines of combat, no charging forces clashing in cinematic glory, just the disorienting scramble of bodies, the sharp edge of fear slicing through the air. The recruit's senses were overwhelmed. The shouting around him seemed to lose its meaning, a blur of voices that might have been calling orders or might have been cries of pain. The dust rose in thick clouds, so dense that the enemy's shapes were obscured, the battlefield more a fog of figures than a scene of conflict. The first swing of his spear felt unreal. more like a reflex than an action he chose to take. He wasn't thinking, he was moving, but everything felt strange. There was no power in his movements, no exhilaration of battle. Instead, there was only disbelief this was really happening, this was real, and yet it didn't feel real. His heart pounded in his chest, but the confusion made it difficult to focus on the beating of his own body. The world was a cacophony of distorted noises, a blur of limbs and shapes that he couldn't quite make sense of. Then, through the haze of dust and noise, he saw it someone fell, their body folding to the ground with a thud that sounded too final. The recruit couldn't tell who it was at first. The figure's face was hidden by the dust, but the reality was inescapable. He had seen men fall before in training, but this was different. This was real. The man did not rise, and the recruit felt something cold settle in his stomach. His first instinct was to turn away, to push the image out of his mind, but he couldn't. In that moment, he knew that this wasn't the game he had thought it was. This was death, and it had come with no ceremony, no warning, just the brutal finality of someone who had been there a moment ago and was now gone. The officers were shouting now, their voices a sharp contrast to the shouts of the men around them, but their commands were nearly lost in the cacophony. "Form up! Hold the line!" They tried to maintain order, but the soldiers were scattered, responding less to strategy than to instinct. The archers, further back, were already firing into the mist of battle, their arrows cutting through the air in sharp, whistling lines. The shields, which had been held loosely at the start, now began to close in tight ranks, the soldiers forming a wall to protect their own. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't heroic, but it was all they could do to survive. The recruit struggled to find his place in the midst of it all. He wasn't sure if he was holding the line or if he was just one more man trying to keep his feet steady. But as he moved, something clicked. Bravery wasn't about charging forward or swinging swords with heroic flourish. Bravery was about standing your ground, about doing the same small thing over and over, despite the terror gnawing at you. The soldiers around him weren't leaping into the fray with reckless abandon. They were moving mechanically, doing their jobs, keeping their shields up, their spears pointed, their steps steady. They weren't heroes, they were survivors. Another wave of chaos hit, and the recruit felt himself stumble. It wasn't the dramatic fall of a warrior in the heat of battle. It was just a trip, a misstep in the dust. He looked down, his foot caught on something unseen, and for a moment the world slowed. He could see the men around him, each one moving in their own small, terrified rhythm, each one doing their best to stay alive. And then, with a sickening thud, he heard another soldier scream as a spear pierced his side. The recruit didn't have time to react. The moment passed, and he was swept back into the movement, the scramble, the madness of the fight. The truth of it struck him then. Many soldiers didn't die in dramatic moments, in the fierce clashes of swords or the noble charges. They died because they tripped, because they hesitated, because they turned their heads at the wrong second. Death in battle wasn't always about heroism. It was about making one small mistake, one small miscalculation, and paying the price for it. As the battle continued, the recruit's thoughts were no longer his own. The chaos, the fear, the sweat it consumed him. But there was something else too, something quieter. The sounds of the fight, the screams, the shuffling, the clanging, all seemed to fade out as quickly as they had come. The world, for a moment, was just dust and shadow, and the recruit's mind seemed to shut down, a protective mechanism to keep him from feeling the full weight of what was happening. And then, just like that, it was over. The clash ended, not with a great cry of victory, but with a quiet, haunting calm. The noise of battle faded, and the world returned to sound. The men were still on edge, their bodies aching, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. The campfires were lit again. The horses shuffled nervously in their pens. But the recruit stood there, his mind trying to catch up with the silence, the weight of what had happened settling over him. He didn't know who had fallen. He didn't know who had survived. But as the sounds of the camp returned to him, as the officers barked new orders and the men began to gather themselves, The recruit realized something. He wasn't the same person who had crossed the river. The man who had stood on the banks of the Nile, uncertain and eager, had been left behind. He was no longer the hopeful boy who had dreamed of battle. He was now part of something different, something darker, something that had already changed him in ways he couldn't yet understand. The army marched on, and so did he. But the first blood had been spilled, and the recruit had learned the true price of war. The aftermath of the battle arrived as quickly as the clash had ended, but the chaos didn't dissipate. It only transformed. The frenzy of violence shifted into a cold, methodical process of tallying, sorting, and counting. The soldiers moved through the remains of the field with the same mechanical precision they had in battle, but now they were counting bodies instead of taking lives. The wounded were gathered, dragged from the scene of conflict, some crying out in pain, others barely moving. Each soldier seemed to take on a task. Some counted arrows, others inspected the dead, while others began to catalogue the supplies that had been scattered in the disorder. In this strange, grim order, numbers once again asserted control. A loss could be measured in men, in arrows, in supplies. Victory was no longer about the blood that had been spilled, but the numbers that remained. The recruit watched the process, disoriented by the stark contrast between the madness of battle and the quiet, grim efficiency that followed it. Captives were gathered, bound, and herded like cattle. The officers negotiated over them, their voices low, their eyes cold and calculating. Prisoners, the recruit learned, were not just casualties, they were assets. They could be labor, leverage, or a message, depending on the needs of the campaign. The idea that prisoners were a resource, a commodity to be used, struck the recruit deeply. He had imagined that once the enemy was defeated, the fight was over, but it wasn't. It was just a shift in power now. It was the soldiers who had to navigate this new, uncomfortable economy of war. Looting, he discovered, wasn't random. It was structured. There were rules, tightly enforced, to ensure that the army didn't descend into chaos. Soldiers could take what they wanted, but only under certain conditions. Looting wasn't just an act of survival, it was a reward, a system meant to incentivize obedience and aggression. However, the line between reward and destruction was razor thin. If a soldier's greed became too obvious, too reckless, it threatened the very structure of the army, and it would be swiftly dealt with. The men didn't loot for personal gain, they looted for the promise of power, for a place in the pecking order. The structure ensured that the army wouldn't fall apart due to uncontrolled desire. Yet, the recruit's discomfort grew as he understood the truth. The army didn't just survive on discipline. It survived on the careful, controlled indulgence of its men's baser instincts. But there was something else that became clear in the aftermath. Mercy, in this world, had its price. The recruit saw one officer release a group of prisoners, offering them a moment of mercy that seemed almost foreign to him. But when another officer learned of it, the act was swiftly punished, not because it was wrong, but because mercy, in this environment, could undermine the carefully cultivated fear that kept the soldiers in line. To show mercy to the enemy could weaken the grip of authority, and that was something that could not be tolerated. The recruit learned, with a chill, that cruelty, when applied correctly, could be a tool of power. Mercy, on the other hand, was a risk, a sign of weakness. To be kind was to be dangerous, and to be harsh was to ensure submission. The decisions the recruit witnessed were delivered as commands, without explanation or justification. There was no room for understanding. Orders came down from above, and the men obeyed, not because they understood, but because they feared what might happen if they didn't. And in that moment, the recruit understood something unsettling. The army wasn't about war, it was about control. The victory didn't end the danger. It only shifted it, changing who was allowed to hurt whom. As the camp settled into its post-battle routine, the recruit felt the weight of everything he had learned. The war had not ended, it had merely evolved. The prisoners were no longer enemies to be defeated, but pieces to be moved. The soldiers, no longer warriors in the traditional sense, had become part of a much larger machine, each man playing his role in a system that was built on fear, control, and submission. And as the recruit lay in his tent that night, the sound of the camp around him, a low murmur of voices, the scraping of gear, the soft crackling of fires felt like the calm before another storm. He knew that the battle had been won, but the real struggle was just beginning. The next phase of the campaign would not be fought with swords or arrows. It would be fought with fear, with power, with the subtle cruelty that held the army together. The real question now wasn't about fighting, it was about survival. The army reached the walls, and the tension that had been simmering since the march took on a new, tangible form. The city loomed before them, its thick stone walls a physical barrier that held not just their enemies, but their fears as well. The sense of a wall wasn't just a blockage. It was a constant reminder that they were trapped in front of it. Each soldier's fear mirrored by the inhabitants inside the city. The silence that fell over the camp was thick, broken only by the sounds of men moving, preparing, as the waiting began. Days stretched out, their passage marked not by the rise and fall of the sun, but by the tightening of rations and the slow erosion of patience. The food that had been plentiful only a short time ago now seemed to slip away with every meal. Men began to eye their fellow soldiers, their tempers fraying as hunger set in. But in the back of each soldier's mind, there was also the knowledge that those within the city, just as hungry, just as afraid, were suffering the same way. It was a psychological game as much as a physical one, each side wondering how long the other would hold out. And as time dragged on, the sense of waiting became suffocating, as if every minute brought them closer to something inevitable. The recruit was put to work immediately, like the others, digging trenches and hauling supplies to build encampments around the city. But this wasn't just any labor. Every task came with the constant threat of arrows, the distant sound of them slicing through the air, reminding him that the work wasn't just about creating a foothold for the siege. It was about surviving the city's defense. The walls that had been their target became a looming presence, both a symbol of their goal and the ever-present danger of failure. The labor was as grueling as anything the recruit had done before, but now it was coupled with the sharp sting of fear. Each shovel of dirt felt heavier, as though it was weighed down not just by the earth, but by the knowledge that every man working was exposed, vulnerable to whatever came next. Despite the physical labor, there was something else happening. The siege was not just fought with walls and weapons, it was fought with fear. The army began to employ tactics that were designed to break the city's spirit rather than its defenses. Messengers were sent with threats, displays of power, intimidation tactics designed to remind the defenders that the army was not just waiting at their gates, but watching them, learning their weaknesses. Psychological warfare was as vital as any physical assault, and the recruit could feel the weight of it. Each time he heard a messenger return, bringing more news, more threats, it wasn't just about strategy. It was about the mind games that would wear the defenders down before the walls ever did. But even this, the recruit understood, it was just another form of labor. The pressure of waiting and working under the constant threat of attack was its own form of exhaustion. Each day blurred into the next, each task feeling like the one before it. The siege, it seemed, wasn't just about breaking the city's walls, it was about breaking the men outside of them. And then came the moment that crystallized the chaos. The city's gate remained closed, the walls towering above the soldiers like a silent judge. The camp, once filled with the noise of labor, now fell into a restless quiet, the air thick with uncertainty. The men moved like ghosts, their movements slow, as if they, too, were waiting for something to happen. The decision loomed ahead. Would they attack? Would the walls finally fall? The waiting had turned into something else, something more dangerous. It wasn't just about the battle anymore. It was about what would come next, when the decision to act would turn the situation from a standstill into something far more catastrophic. The tension was palpable, the weight of it settling over the camp like the oppressive heat of the sun. The gate remained closed, but the moment of action was drawing closer. The recruit, his muscles sore and his mind weary, found himself staring at the gate, wondering what would come next, knowing that whatever it was, it would change everything. The wall didn't just block their way, it trapped them, bound them in a game of waiting, a game where fear played as much a role as strength. And as the recruit stood there, his thoughts racing, he knew that the real battle was just beginning. The tension in the camp wasn't just physical, it was moral too. Before every battle, before every skirmish, the men gathered in small circles, muttering prayers to the gods. The recruit watched, a part of him unsure whether he was participating in a ritual or just observing a pattern. The gods were called upon for strength, for protection, for victory. But there was an undeniable undercurrent to the prayers. They were asking for favor, but they were also preparing to break the bodies and spirits of others. There was a contradiction in the air, one that wasn't addressed but simply accepted. These prayers, full of devotion, seemed so out of place when contrasted with the violence they were about to commit. Amulets hung from the wrists of men as they tightened their armor, small charms that were supposed to ward off evil or bring good fortune in battle. The recruit had seen them before, tucked into the folds of soldiers' clothing, each one carrying personal significance. Yet, as the army prepared to assault the city, the significance of those trinkets seemed trivial. The contrast was stark. The same hands that clutched their amulets would soon be wielding weapons meant to destroy, to kill. Officers, too, spoke of divine order, weaving the gods into their orders with ease. It wasn't an abstract doctrine they followed, it was woven into the very fabric of their justification. To them, hunger, fire, and death were simply the will of the gods, necessary tools to fulfill a higher purpose. The army didn't just march on supplies and discipline. It marched on the belief that their violence was sanctioned, that it was part of the divine order of the world. But the recruit wasn't so sure. He watched the men pray, but he couldn't shake the feeling that what they were about to do, what they were prepared to do, wasn't as simple as divine will. He realized that right and necessary were not the same things, and that the officers, the men in charge, blurred those lines on purpose. What was necessary for the conquest, what was necessary for their survival, wasn't always what was morally right. In this world, it didn't matter. Soldiers were tools of the state, and their actions were justified by whatever was needed to maintain the flow of power. Victory could always be dressed up in the language of righteousness, but beneath it all was fear, fatigue, and compromise. A small revelation hit him in a quiet moment as the fires of the siege began to crackle in the distance. He realized that the war he had imagined, the one he had been told about back home, was different from the one he was living. Propaganda would later glorify the conflict, depicting it as clean, righteous, and triumphant, an image of noble men fighting for the glory of Egypt. But the soldiers didn't live it that way. They lived it in the trenches, in the mess of dust and blood and sweat. They lived it in fear, in exhaustion, and in compromise, where right and wrong blurred and the reality of survival came before the ideals of battle. The stories they would tell later would be nothing like the truth of what had happened. The recruit saw that the story Egypt would tell about this campaign would be nothing like what he was living. It would be a story of valor, of victory, of divine will fulfilled. But for the soldiers, it was a story of men broken by labor, by hunger, by the weight of the things they had to do in order to survive. What Egypt would remember would be a far cry from the brutal truth of the soldiers' lives. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the order to light the first fire was given, and the camp became a blur of motion. The flames began to rise, lighting up the dark sky, casting flickering shadows across the soldiers' faces. It was a moment of triumph in the eyes of the officers, a symbol of their power, a signal that the siege had truly begun. But the recruit couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't victory they were creating. It was destruction. The fire would soon turn the city into smoke. But it was also turning the soldiers into something else. He wasn't sure what. A part of him wanted to look away, to block out the rising smoke, but he couldn't. The smoke wasn't just a signal of war, it was the sign of something else, something he had begun to understand. The recruit's mind raced, trying to piece together what he was witnessing. The prayers, the amulets, the officers speaking of divine order, it all felt like a flimsy veil over what was happening. He had expected to fight for a cause, but now, as the flames grew higher, he was starting to see that the real battle wasn't just against the enemy. It was against the world. They had created a world where violence was justified, where morality was flexible, and where survival depended on doing the things that should never be done. The fire wasn't just a weapon against the city. It was a signal that something much deeper was changing in the men who wielded it. The real question, for the recruit, was whether he could ever find his way back from this. The world had shifted, and as the flames crackled louder, the recruit wondered if the man who had entered this campaign, full of hope and fear, was still standing behind the walls of the camp. The siege had stretched on far longer than the recruit had expected. The walls had loomed larger with each passing day, and the weight of waiting had begun to wear down even the hardiest among them. Now, the pressure was building, not just from the enemy inside, but from the men beside him. The commanders had started to play every card they had left. Promises of loot, threats of punishment, reminders of duty, of home, of what they were fighting for. But none of these words seemed to have the same weight they had once held. Men who had once been eager to fight now looked past their officers, their eyes hollow with fatigue, longing for the end any end. The promises seemed distant, their power slipping with each delay. And then it happened. The siege, once a slow and grinding endeavor, broke open. The officers barked orders, but even the most disciplined soldiers moved with a certain weariness, as if they were too tired to feel the full weight of the moment. The gates, which had been the target of so much effort, were breached. But there was no victory in the moment, only the grim realization that the worst was still ahead. As the walls crumbled and the city's defenses began to give way, the recruit realized that the hardest part wasn't the fight, it was what came next. The pressure had accumulated for weeks, and it was starting to show in ways that were not immediately visible. The brutality of war, he had assumed, was driven by hate or cruelty. But as the men stormed through the city gates, something darker emerged. The most brutal acts weren't necessarily committed by sadists, but by exhausted men who had lost their ability to think beyond the end. It was the weariness, the desperation for a quicker end, that pushed soldiers to do things they might have once found unthinkable. The recruits saw it in the way some men acted during the initial chaos, faces twisted, movements jerky, as if they were no longer sure of the difference between their enemies and their allies. Fear, it seemed, was the true enemy now, and it made men do things that couldn't be undone. Another twist to the grim scene emerged, as the recruit noticed the diversity within the ranks. The soldiers around him weren't just Egyptians. There were foreigners, mercenaries, captives, men from distant lands who had been swept into the empire's machinery of conquest. Some had been pressed into service, others had joined willingly, but all of them were now part of the same army. The language was different, the accents varied, and the methods of fighting sometimes felt foreign, even to the men who had been trained as soldiers. He could see it in the way some men fought with brutal efficiency, while others hesitated, unsure of the violence they were committing. It wasn't just that these men were new to the army, they were new to the idea of conquest itself. The recruit had never thought of it this way before, but now it was clear. The empire didn't just run on the strength of its own people. It ran on mixed hands, on men who had little in common beyond the task at hand. The force that had once seemed so unified, so singular, was in fact a mosaic, a collection of different men, each with their own motivations, their own pasts. The empire was not one entity. It was a patchwork, held together by violence and necessity. As the city began to fall, the recruit felt the weight of what was happening in a new way. The walls had broken, but the breach had also broken something inside him. The hardest battle was not going to be fought on the streets of the city. It would be fought within him. Once the gate was breached, once the enemy was defeated, the real question was not how many men they could kill, but what they would become in the process. The soldiers had been so focused on victory that they hadn't stopped to consider what victory would cost them. The quiet truth settled in. The hardest battle was not against the enemies inside the walls. It was against the soldier they were about to become, a person forged not by the ideals they had once held, but by the violence and fear they had been forced to endure. As the city fell, the recruit understood that this wasn't just a war for territory, it was a war for the very soul of the men who fought it. The hardest part, he realized, was knowing that he had no idea who he would be when it was over. The morning after the battle broke, the air was thick with a strange stillness. The sounds of conflict had faded, replaced by the hum of a different kind of order taking shape. Soldiers now lined the streets, standing watch over the conquered city, their weapons at the ready but their faces distant, resigned. The frenzy of war had given way to something far less romantic: bureaucracy. The conquerors, it seemed, had not come just to fight. They had come to administer, to measure, to extract. The scribes were already at work, recording everything. Every bit of loot was accounted for, every prisoner catalogued. The spoils of war, once a symbol of victory, were now items on a ledger, nothing more than numbers on a page. Officials roamed the streets, assigning labor to the new subjects of the empire. Tasks that had once been the responsibilities of the city's own people now fell to them under the watchful eyes of their new rulers. The city's fate was no longer decided by battle, but by the slow, grinding force of administration. The recruit was assigned to occupation duty, a role that he had not imagined. The authority that had once felt like something to fight for now seemed a burden. He watched as the conquered people, those who had once fought fiercely against their invaders, now shuffled through the streets, subjected to the whim of the empire. They were being taught new rules, new ways of living under the eye of their conquerors. He had imagined conquest as an end, something heroic, something decisive, but now it was clear. The real work of war wasn't the battle. It was the business that followed. As the days passed, the recruit began to see the true nature of empire building. Conquest wasn't just about winning fights, it was about expanding an administration. The war had been the first step, but the second, more insidious step was the paperwork that followed. The empire didn't just take land, it measured it. It named it. It extracted from it. What had once been a thriving, independent city was now just another piece of land to be catalogued, taxed, and controlled. The tension between the conquerors and the conquered was tangible. The recruit found himself on the other side of the divide now, not as a soldier fighting an enemy, but as an enforcer of a new order. He saw how some soldiers were made settlers, how they were offered land and resources in exchange for remaining behind to secure the empire's hold on the territory. Others, perhaps, would become garrison families, families who would be tied to foreign soil for generations, their futures intertwined with the empire's ever-expanding borders. For the first time, the recruit began to feel the weight of his role. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was part of the machine, part of the system that turned victory into administration. The soldiers who had once fought with fervor now found themselves settling into a new kind of routine, one of measurement, control, and survival. The idea of home had begun to feel distant, a place that was no longer a tangible, safe retreat, but something to be fought for, perhaps lost forever. The battle had ended. The war was over. But the recruit couldn't help but wonder, after all this, what did going home even mean? Was it just returning to the land he had come from, or had he already crossed a threshold, one that made returning impossible? He was now bound to the empire, to the land he had helped conquer, in ways that would last far longer than any battle or campaign. Home wasn't something he could walk back into. It was something that had changed him just as much as he had. Changed the land. The weight of that realization settled heavily on him, a quiet, unspoken truth. The hardest part of war was never the fighting. It was what came after and how it changed everything. The journey back, or the imagined return, was something the recruit had held on to through the long, grueling days of the campaign. Home was a mirage, a place he thought about when the heat became unbearable or when the weight of the labor threatened to break him. In his mind, it was a sanctuary, a refuge from the chaos and destruction he had witnessed. He thought about the familiar faces, the sounds of the village, the way the river looked at dusk, the smell of fresh bread from his mother's kitchen. But home, like any mirage, was slipping out of reach as reality set in. As the army moved closer to the edge of what they knew, the recruit allowed himself to imagine the village as he had left it. But the documentary's careful observations began to cut through that illusion. The flood seasons had passed times that once signified rhythm, prosperity, and hope now had passed without him, his family caught in the cycle of their own survival. Children who had once been small and needy were now older, their faces different. Households had rearranged, finding new rhythms around his absence, and where he once stood, there were only traces of his memory. Time had moved on, and in his absence, the village had continued without him. The recruit began to realize that the home he longed for was no longer the home he had left. There was a gnawing uncertainty about what would await him. Would he return as a hero, as the man who had gone to war and survived, or would he be a stranger to those he had once known? Would his return be a celebration, or would it be the realization that everything, his family, his place in the world had changed, just as he had? But there was another twist, one that upended everything the recruit had assumed. Most soldiers, he learned, didn't return home immediately after the campaign. The state, in its ever-expanding web, rarely released trained manpower back into civilian life easily. Instead, soldiers were often reassigned, stationed elsewhere, absorbed into new duties. The idea of returning home, of picking up where he had left off, was a false promise. The promise of a return, of finding peace and comfort, was postponed indefinitely, swallowed up by the needs of the empire. Soldiers were valuable resources to be utilized, not discarded. The illusion of home was just another cog in the state's machinery, something to be desired but rarely granted. The recruit's stomach twisted at the realization. Survival didn't automatically buy a way back. Home was not a given. It was a luxury that might never be realized. Even if he had made it through the worst of the campaign, even if he had fought and survived, he might never return to the place he had imagined. The section ended in a quiet, aching scene. Perhaps he returned home, but it felt wrong. Everything was different. Nothing aligned with the memory he had held on to. Or maybe a letter arrived instead, one with promises of return, but the letter had never made it. Either way, it didn't matter. The recruit was left wondering what would come next. What would happen to the men who survived, who fought but could not return? This was the true cost of survival, not death on the battlefield, but the quiet dissolution of the promise of home, leaving the recruit and the audience with an aching question. What happens when home is no longer an option? The audience, emotionally hooked, was left to ponder the truth of what would come after the war, not just for the recruit, but for all who fought, who survived, and who would forever live in the shadow of a promise that could never be kept. After the campaign, the idea of reward loomed large in the minds of every soldier. The promises had been made: rations owed, possible land grants, new titles, and the honor of becoming part of the veteran community. These rewards, however, quickly became a delicate balance between hope and trap. The soldiers clung to the idea of being owed something for their service, but the reality of receiving these rewards was far more uncertain. The process of claiming what was owed to them was a labyrinth of bureaucracy. Rations were promised, but they were often delayed or lost in the maze of records. Land grants, which were supposed to be an incentive for their loyalty, were frequently unfulfilled or evaporated through corruption. Titles and positions in veteran communities were handed out, but often came with strings attached, leaving soldiers caught in the same cycle of dependency they had fought so hard to escape. In this world of papyrus and ink, a single lost document could erase all proof of entitlement, leaving the soldier with nothing but a vague memory of promises made. There were moments of upward mobility, however. Veterans who were able to leverage their service sometimes found positions as guards, administrators, or foremen, offering a new sense of status. Yet, this rise in rank often bound them even tighter, to the very structures of power that had caused their suffering. The irony wasn't lost on the recruit, who watched some of his comrades rise only to find themselves caught in the web of a bureaucracy they had once fought to escape. But even as soldiers navigated these opportunities, the true cost of war was rarely addressed head-on. Trauma seeped into their lives, but it was never named. It showed in the small, telling behaviors, restlessness that couldn't be soothed, sudden bursts of anger that left family members wary, or withdrawal into silence. These signs of suffering were displayed in the private moments at home, where the recruit watched his comrades try to rebuild their lives. There were no modern labels for what they were experiencing, no name for the deep, lasting effects of war. Instead, it leaked out in the way they interacted with their families, in the way they couldn't quite fit back into the lives they had once left behind. The tension between the visible honor of being a veteran and the invisible cost of their experiences was palpable. The soldiers were valued by the state, but their value was fragile, defined not by their service, but by a record that could be easily erased or manipulated. The reward they sought seemed so close, so tangible, yet it was continually slipping through their fingers. As the recruit moved through these difficult realizations, he understood that the true price of service wasn't always seen in the bloodshed of battle or the loss of life. It was in the quiet aftermath, in the way the soldiers were left to navigate a world where promises were broken, trauma went unnamed, and the very rewards they sought often trapped them in new forms of dependency and control. The state may have called them valued, but the reality of their value could vanish the moment the ink went missing from a record. The question now loomed larger. Did the soldiers truly gain anything from their service, or were they simply spent and discarded, caught in a cycle that would never end? The recruit found himself asking the same question, and as he looked around at the men who had fought beside him, he wondered if anyone could answer it honestly. The promise of a better life seemed as distant as the enemy they had once fought. The past, as it has been handed down to us, is polished. Tomb paintings line the walls of Egypt's ancient monuments, vivid depictions of soldiers standing upright, fearless, and clean, always poised in the moment of victory. Victory inscriptions echo throughout the temples, memorializing battles fought and won with seemingly effortless might. These images, meant to immortalize the glory of Egypt's conquests, paint soldiers as paragons of strength and honor, idealized figures who have come to represent the very essence of the state's power and divinity. But as the recruit watches these polished representations from his present vantage point, he feels the weight of contrast. The warriors in these paintings are not the men he knew. His comrades were not statuesque figures poised for greatness, but tired, worn men, struggling to survive one more day, one more mile. The soldiers in these depictions stand on pedestals, while the soldiers he fought beside were lost in the grind of war, their struggles mostly unseen. The gap between the public image and lived reality is not just a matter of artistic license. It is a reflection of how history is often shaped, edited, and refined. The most vivid sources from Egypt's past, the grand paintings, the heroic inscriptions, the monuments to victory, are often nothing more than propaganda. They serve a purpose: to glorify, to mythologize, to solidify the power of the state. But in the cracks of these monumental narratives, the truth is quieter, more mundane. Letters, ration lists, injury notes, and abandoned equipment tell a different story, one that lives not in the grandiose, but in the everyday. The recruit's life, his service, the camaraderie, and the suffering, all of it, lies outside the polished image that has been handed down. These small, seemingly insignificant documents reveal the truth of war's toll on men, the cost that is rarely written into the glorious tales told by the powerful. History, it turns out, is not just about what happened, it's about what survives. And survival is selective. These mundane records, these fleeting glimpses of the soldiers' realities, are often the ones that endure, hidden in the margins of the grand story. They were not meant to be preserved for posterity. The world wanted the idealized version, the heroic tale. But in those forgotten documents, the true lives of the soldiers whisper to us. The recruit's story is not one that will be celebrated in the monuments of Egypt. His name will never be etched alongside the great victories of the empire. But his footsteps, his suffering, his labor, his survival shaped the very land he fought for. These small details, the ones no one bothered to immortalize, are the real building blocks of history. The land, the borders, the temples, all these were shaped by the hands of men like him. Men whose names are lost to time but whose impact remains. The section ends with a haunting thought. The recruit's story may never be recorded by name, but it is woven into the very fabric of the empire he fought for. He will never be remembered as a hero or a general, but he is part of the collective memory of the empire, an unacknowledged cornerstone of the civilization. And while the official narratives will go on, glorifying the triumphs of those who wielded power, the true stories, those of the soldiers who bled and died in service, remain buried in the margins of forgotten paperwork. The audience is invited to consider this. The history we know is not the whole truth. It is only the story that survived, shaped by those who had the power to write it. And in the shadows of that narrative, there are lives like the recruits' lives that shaped borders, built temples, and were ultimately forgotten. In the quiet of those margins, the recruit's legacy persists, and the true cost of empire is slowly revealed. As the documentary prepares to conclude, it hints at the final question. How does the soldier live on, long after the dust has settled? How is he remembered, misunderstood, and finally rediscovered by future generations? The story of the recruit is not finished. It's merely waiting to be uncovered. Egypt's monuments and temples are replete with images of military might, carved walls depicting victories, pharaohs towering over their defeated enemies, ranks of soldiers standing in perfect order, their faces frozen in idealized strength. The recruit's life, his experiences, stands in stark contrast to these grand images. He is a shadow beside a statue, a fleeting presence in the larger, more powerful narrative of Egypt's eternal might. The soldiers, who once bled and fought in the dust, are transformed in these images into something different, something abstract, something clean. The pain, the fear, the hunger, all vanish in the polished stone and flawless lines of the carvings. This contrast between representation and experience is uncanny. The carvings, meticulously chiseled into the stone, smooth over the complexities of real life, turning pain and suffering into something certain, something eternal. The warriors are no longer men who bled and felt fear. They are statues immobile, unyielding, and heroic. The real march, which had been dusty and grueling, is wiped away by the glimmer of idealization. The stone soldiers stand with unwavering resolve, their eyes fixed on some distant, glorious horizon. The recruit's fear, his sweat, and his fatigue are lost in the image. But these scenes were not neutral records, they were tools, political instruments designed to assure the population of the strength and righteousness of their rulers and to intimidate potential rivals. These images were crafted not to tell the truth of the battle, but to tell the story the pharaohs wanted told, a story of invincibility and divine favor. The soldier, in this context, was not a man, but a symbol. He was part of the larger narrative, a cog in the machinery of state propaganda, his individual suffering erased in service of a more powerful, unified vision of empire. The carvings were silent, persuasive, and carefully composed, each figure positioned to convey the strength and order of the empire, each muscle and line sculpted to project power. In contrast, the reality of the recruit's experience was chaotic, filled with uncertainty, fatigue, and fear. He fought not for glory, but to survive, to endure the slow, relentless pressure of a war that would not end in a single battle, but in the grinding away of men like him. As the camera pans over the detailed carvings, it's easy to imagine the soldiers in their perfect rows, standing proudly beside their pharaohs. Their forms are so precisely rendered that they almost appear alive, commanding, unyielding. But behind the scenes, the reality was far different. The soldiers, including the recruit, were not invincible. They were vulnerable, fragile, human. They were one illness, one misstep, one injury away from being erased, nothing more than a forgotten name on a lost list, their story fading like dust in the wind. The soldier, as Egypt presented him, was eternal, etched into the stone, forever the image of courage and order. But in life, he was fragile, easily lost in the sprawling bureaucracy of empire. The stones, over time, would outlast the soldiers, standing as silent reminders of a past that had been carefully curated and immortalized. But for those who had lived it, the real story was never as neat as the carvings suggested. The glory of battle, the heroism, the triumph, it was always presented as a certainty. But behind that certainty was the real march, the real fight, which was uncertain, exhausting, and full of unseen costs. This gap between representation and experience, between myth and reality, is what makes the story of the recruit so compelling. The soldiers are immortalized, but the truth of their lives, of their pain, fear, and sacrifice, is buried beneath layers of stone and myth. The audience is left to wonder how many other stories like his have been erased, how many other soldiers have been lost in the process of creating a perfect history. In stone, the soldier looks eternal, but in life, he was one illness away from being forgotten. The stone may have withstood the passage of time, but the men who served never had that luxury. The real soldiers, the ones who bled and died, are not the ones etched into history. They are the ones lost to time, their stories fading as the stone carvings stood silently, watching. The search for the true story of the soldier began with the smallest, most unassuming pieces of evidence. The narrator moves through the physical remnants of soldiers' lives, graves, weapons, and fractured bones, and presents these details not as scientific facts, but as clues in an unfolding mystery. These are the silent witnesses to the lives of ordinary men who fought for an empire, their stories hidden beneath layers of time. The audience is invited to follow along, piecing together what can be learned from what was left behind. There are no grand monuments to these soldiers, no soaring inscriptions. Instead, what remains are the small, humble remnants of their existence. The objects uncovered are often simple and unremarkable: a patched sandal, a reused spearhead, the chipped edge of a broken tool, or the healed fracture in a long-buried heel bone. These artifacts suggest something more than the glory of conquest. They tell of endurance, hardship, and resourcefulness, traits that soldiers needed far more than the heroic actions that are often celebrated in the official records. It is in these small, worn-out objects that the true story of the soldiers emerges, a story not of triumph, but of survival. The objects, often overlooked, hold the key to understanding what these men endured on a daily basis. A surprising twist comes with the discovery of the diversity within Egypt's forces. The narrative moves beyond the idea of a monolithic, uniform army and reveals that Egypt's soldiers were far more varied than popular imagination allows. The army was composed not just of Egyptians, but of regional recruits, foreigners, and specialists who brought their own skills, accents, and methods of warfare. This army was not a single, homogeneous force. It was adaptive, shaped by the needs of the empire and the men who served within it. The recruit's experience, shaped by these diverse forces, reflects the complexity of the empire itself, neither simple nor static, but a constantly shifting system of power and adaptation. As the audience begins to understand the reality of the soldiers' lives, the pieces of the puzzle start to click into place. The true story of the soldiers was not one of polished glory and clean victories. It was broad, messy, and deeply human. The artifacts, the broken sandals, the fractured bones, tell a story of an army that was shaped more by survival and resourcefulness than by the grand narratives carved into the walls of temples. These soldiers, from all walks of life, were less concerned with the myths of heroism than with making it through each day. The loudest stories may have been carved into the temples, immortalized in the grand images of victory, but the truest ones might be hiding in the cracked heel bone of an unnamed soldier. The most significant truths often lie in the unspoken, the overlooked, the mundane. It is through these small fragments that the real history of the soldiers can be uncovered pieces of their lives that tell a much more complex and human story than the official narrative ever could. This section, framed as a discovery, brings the audience into a deeper understanding of the soldiers' realities. It shows them that history is not just what is remembered, it is what has survived, and how we read the signs that have been left behind. The soldier's experience, as seen through the lens of these humble artifacts, is a far more nuanced tale than the heroic images painted on temple walls. As the documentary nears its end, the narrator takes us back to the river. But this return isn't a reset, it's a mirror. The water flows past the land, its surface still and unyielding, reflecting a kingdom built by hands like the recruits. The narrator weaves together the puzzle of his life, conscription as arithmetic, where men are chosen not for their valor, but for their place in the numbers, training as a transformation, bending bodies and minds to the will of the empire, war as labor, a grueling test of endurance rather than heroism, victory as bureaucracy, where triumph is measured not in blood, but in the proper allocation of resources. Memory, too, is selective, shaped, and molded by the powerful into stories that fit their narrative, leaving the true costs of empire hidden in the margins. But in the quiet twist that the recruit now understands, his greatest impact may not have been in battle, but in the silent, cumulative weight of millions of footsteps like his. It is these steps, these mundane acts of survival, labor, and compliance that sustained the empire. It was the unseen workers, the unnamed soldiers, the forgotten bodies that made Egypt feel immortal, giving it the illusion of permanence. The true strength of the empire was not in the grand structures or the famous rulers, but in the relentless continuity of ordinary lives, stretched out across time, each one playing a part in the machine that never stopped moving. The tone of the conclusion remains calm, but with an undercurrent of something unsettling. Like a bedtime story that refuses to comfort completely, it leaves the viewer with a lingering sense of unease. The recruit's story, like so many others, is not a tale of glory, but one of quiet, unnoticed sacrifice. The empire may have felt eternal, but in truth, it was built by people whose names were barely remembered, whose stories were lost to time. The final invitation to the audience is simple but powerful. When you picture ancient Egypt, see not only pharaohs and pyramids, but the ordinary bodies that carried the kingdom on their backs. See the workers, the soldiers, the laborers who walked in silence and whose steps have echoed through history, often without recognition and often without return. As the camera lingers on the river, the final line fades into a reflective outro, a question hanging in the air. How many stories like the recruits are still buried, waiting to be uncovered? The march continues in memory, and the mystery remains.